World War II was the most devastating conflict in history, but the real tragedy? It wasn't just the battles or the bombs, it was the colossal mistakes made by some of the world's most powerful figures. Today, we're diving into the 16 biggest idiots of World War II, those who changed the course of history, for all the wrong reasons. Let's get into it. These leaders, generals, and figures made decisions that not only shaped the war, but ruined countless lives and led to devastating consequences. And trust me, you won't believe what they did. First up, we've got Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany, a man who rose to power on the backs of a broken economy and a shattered nation, promising to restore Germany to greatness. But little did he know, his arrogance and delusion would lead to a war that would tear the world apart. In 1941, Hitler made the ultimate mistake. He launched Operation Barbarossa, a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest land invasion in human history, with over 3 million Axis troops marching across Eastern Europe. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union could be crushed in a matter of months. His goal was simple: invade, conquer, and destroy communism before the Russian winter. But history had already shown how disastrous such an invasion could be. Napoleon tried the same thing in 1812, only to be stopped by snow, starvation, and the endless Russian land. But Hitler, in his arrogance, thought he could do better, and as the Germans stormed through Soviet territory, his forces were slowed by logistical issues, disorganized leadership, and a lack of preparedness for the harsh winter conditions. The mistake: not preparing for the cold. Hitler had assumed the operation would be over before winter set in, so he failed to provide proper cold weather gear for his soldiers. Tanks froze, guns jammed, and men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. By the time the Soviet winter arrived, the Germans were already far from ready. But Hitler didn't learn from history, and his delusion turned into a catastrophe. The result? More than 4 million Axis soldiers died in the Soviet Union. Entire cities were destroyed. The Eastern Front became a graveyard for Nazi troops. By 1943, the Germans had lost Stalingrad, one of the most brutal battles in history. What started as a blitzkrieg turned into a grinding, bloody nightmare. The world would never forget the devastation Hitler had brought upon his own people, and the innocent lives lost in the wake of his madness. Imagine, a man who thought he could conquer Russia with arrogance alone, and the only thing standing between him and his dream? Winter coats. Next, we head to Japan, where we meet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant naval strategist, but one who in the end was forced into a disastrous decision. Yamamoto had always warned against going to war with the United States, understanding the sheer industrial might of the American machine. But in 1941, under orders from Tokyo, Yamamoto carried out the unthinkable: a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The plan was simple: cripple the US Pacific Fleet before it could interfere with Japan's plans to expand across Southeast Asia. Yamamoto hoped to delay American intervention long enough to secure Japan's empire. But what Yamamoto failed to understand, despite being a brilliant strategist, was the resolve of the American people. He feared that by striking, he would awaken a sleeping giant. And he was right. On December 7, 1941, over 350 Japanese aircraft launched from 6 carriers and attacked Pearl Harbor, causing massive damage and killing over 2,400 Americans. The attack was devastating, but it left one major flaw. The US aircraft carriers, the backbone of the Pacific Fleet, were not at the base that day. They were out at sea. And that's where Yamamoto made his fatal mistake. Despite his own doubts about Japan's ability to win a prolonged war with the US, he gambled on a quick knockout. What followed was not the crippling of the American fleet, but a rallying of American strength, industry, and military might that would crush Japan's hopes in the Pacific. Within 6 months, Yamamoto's forces suffered a crushing defeat at Midway, where Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers in a single day. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. Yamamoto had woken the giant, and now it was coming for him. In 1943, his plane was ambushed and shot down over the South Pacific. The man who had once predicted the war would be unwinnable now found himself dead, a victim of his own miscalculations. Yamamoto poked the sleeping giant and woke it up, and once awakened, it was relentless. 3. Let's talk about Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader who thought he could stand shoulder to shoulder with Hitler, but instead ended up making a fool of himself on the world stage. Mussolini came to power in 1922, promising to restore Italy to its former glory. But by 1940, Mussolini had learned nothing from his mistakes. He decided to join the war on Hitler's side, believing that Italy could conquer territories across Africa and Europe. Mussolini's first blunder came when he decided to invade Greece in October 1940. He believed that Italy, with its poorly equipped and poorly trained army, could easily overpower the Greeks. He was wrong. The Greeks fought back with fierce determination, and soon the Italian forces were bogged down, unable to make progress. What followed was a humiliating retreat for Mussolini's forces, but the true failure was Mussolini's refusal to admit defeat. Instead of retreating, he doubled down on his blunders, seeking help from Hitler, who was already stretched thin with his own military campaigns. The Germans had to divert troops to save Mussolini's failing invasion, which delayed the critical Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Mussolini's inability to acknowledge his failures cost him dearly. His military campaigns were nothing more than a series of embarrassing defeats. In the end, Mussolini became a puppet of Nazi Germany. As the Allies invaded Italy in 1943, Mussolini fled to the north, where he was eventually captured and executed by partisans in 1945. A dictator who believed in glory, but failed to understand the true nature of war. Mussolini's hubris led to his downfall, and in the end he was left hanging from a gas station in Milan, a grim reminder of his failure. 4. Now let's turn to France, where we find the Maginot Line, a symbol of military overconfidence and failure. After World War I, French military planners believed they could never be caught off guard again. They built an elaborate series of fortifications along their eastern border, known as the Maginot Line. This fortress was designed to withstand artillery, survive bombings, and funnel enemy troops into carefully planned killing zones. It was the pinnacle of military engineering. But there was one critical flaw in this plan. The Maginot Line ended at the Ardennes forest, a rugged, thickly wooded region between Belgium and Luxembourg that the French military believed was impassable for tanks. They never thought the Germans would try to bypass the line and invade through the Ardennes. But they did. In May 1940, Hitler's forces sent 7 panzer divisions through the Ardennes, breaking through the thinly defended area in just 4 days. The French High Command was caught off guard, and instead of adapting to the rapidly changing situation, they clung to the belief that the Maginot Line would hold. It didn't. By the time the French realized their mistake, it was too late. The Germans quickly moved through France, capturing over 2 million French soldiers and forcing the country to surrender in just 6 weeks. The Maginot Line, once seen as an impenetrable defense, was left abandoned, and its fortifications were rendered useless. France, with all its pride in modern engineering, failed to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. The Maginot Line became a symbol of defeat, one that cost France its freedom and its pride. 5. We turn to Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe commander who promised Hitler that he would defeat the Royal Air Force and clear the skies for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Göring had everything on his side. The Luftwaffe was the most powerful air force in the world, and Britain seemed vulnerable. But Göring's greatest mistake came when he allowed his ego and his pride to get in the way of strategy. Instead of focusing on Britain's airfields and radar stations, Göring shifted the focus of the bombing campaign to London, in retaliation for the British bombing of Berlin. He believed that by terrorizing the civilian population, he could break Britain's resolve. But in doing so, he gave the Royal Air Force a chance to recover. While the Luftwaffe was bombing London, the British airfields were repaired, the pilots rotated, and Britain's defences grew stronger. Göring had allowed the RAF to breathe when they should have been crushed. The result? The Battle of Britain became a turning point in the war. The Luftwaffe's once dominant air superiority was shattered, and the Germans were forced to postpone their invasion of Britain indefinitely. Goering's reputation, once untouchable, was forever tarnished. In the years that followed, as Germany's position deteriorated, Goering became a figure of ridicule, eventually captured by Allied forces in 1945. Goering's pride and his failure to stick to the plan cost Germany one of the most critical battles of the war. His promises of victory turned into a tragic farce. As we proceed to the next, if you think these decisions were some of the dumbest in history, give this video a like, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more insane historical moments. Drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from and who you think deserves a spot on this list. 6. We turn to Joseph Stalin, the iron-fisted leader of the Soviet Union, a man whose paranoia and brutal tactics would become one of the most destructive forces of the 20th century. Stalin was known for his purges, eliminating anyone he suspected of disloyalty, and for the fear he instilled in everyone around him. But his greatest failure came in 1941, when he refused to believe intelligence reports warning him that Hitler was planning to invade the Soviet Union. Stalin, obsessed with his own control and dismissive of his advisors, ignored the warnings from his spies and generals. He had grown accustomed to silencing anyone who questioned him, and in doing so, he left his country exposed to disaster. Even when the warnings grew louder and more urgent, Stalin continued to dismiss them, convinced that Hitler would honor their non-aggression pact. But on June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, and over 3 million German troops crossed into Soviet territory. Stalin's inaction turned a preventable disaster into one of the deadliest invasions in history. The German forces quickly overran Soviet defenses, and the Red Army was left scrambling to mount a defense. Millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, and entire cities fell under German control. Stalin's initial silence in the face of this threat caused confusion and paralysis within his own ranks, making it even harder to mount a response. But the most painful consequence came in the form of staggering human loss. Soviet casualties were astronomical, with millions killed, wounded, or displaced. The war on the Eastern Front would become the deadliest theater of the war, and Stalin's failure to act swiftly and decisively had paved the way for a nightmare. Stalin's paranoia and his refusal to trust his own intelligence services left his country wide open to an invasion. A leader who once controlled everything with an iron fist had allowed his own delusions to blind him to the greatest threat of his life. 7. Now, we move to the leader of Free France, Charles de Gaulle, a man whose arrogance almost cost his country dearly during the darkest days of World War II. When the Germans invaded France in 1940, de Gaulle, then a general, was one of the few who refused to surrender. He fled to London, where he became the symbol of resistance. But it wasn't his military prowess or his strategic brilliance that would shape his legacy. It was his inability to work with others. De Gaulle's obsession with his own image and power alienated many of his fellow leaders in the resistance. While the rest of the Allies were coordinating strategies, de Gaulle's ego drove him to isolate himself from others. His refusal to collaborate with the British and the Americans was seen as a major obstacle to the war effort, and his insistence on being the sole voice of France led to many critical delays and misunderstandings. At a crucial time, de Gaulle's isolationism meant that France was not fully integrated into the Allied planning for D-Day. His arrogance and lack of diplomatic skill caused unnecessary friction between the Free French forces and their allies. When the invasion of Normandy came in June 1944, France had to rebuild its political and military cohesion after the occupation, and de Gaulle's reluctance to unite with the broader coalition made the process even more difficult. De Gaulle's failure to recognize that he wasn't the only important figure in the resistance delayed the liberation of his own country, causing more pain for the French people. De Gaulle, the leader who would eventually rebuild France, almost destroyed the unity necessary for victory. His desire for personal glory cost his country dearly during the most critical moments of the war. 8. We come to Emperor Hirohito of Japan, a figurehead whose power in Japan was immense, but whose actual decisions during the war were far more murky. While many associate Hirohito with the horrors of Japanese imperialism, the reality is far more complex. Hirohito's major mistake wasn't just his support for Japan's war efforts, it was his failure to control the military and prevent Japan from engaging in catastrophic battles that were ultimately futile. Hirohito's blind obedience to the military leaders who dominated Japan during the war led to his empire's slow unraveling. Despite having the power to intervene in military decisions, Hirohito deferred to generals and admirals who pushed for aggressive expansion across the Pacific. Even when the tides of war turned against Japan, Hirohito did little to curb the reckless ambitions of his military leaders, leading to Japan's ultimate defeat. Japan's commitment to a war it could never win led to the destruction of entire cities and the deaths of millions of soldiers and civilians. From the brutal invasion of China to the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hirohito's decisions, or lack thereof, created a cycle of violence that eventually brought Japan to the brink of collapse. When the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hirohito, now deeply aware of the war's disastrous course, was forced to intervene. He surrendered Japan, but it was too late to prevent the unimaginable loss that had already been inflicted. Hirohito may not have been the architect of Japan's war efforts, but his failure to act decisively and his blind trust in the military led to the devastation of his people. His empire crumbled under the weight of decisions he refused to make. 9. Let's talk about Erwin Rommel, one of the most celebrated generals of World War II. Known as the Desert Fox, Rommel was hailed for his brilliance in North Africa, where his forces outmaneuvered and defeated the British time and time again. He was a master of mobile warfare, using the desert terrain to his advantage. But Rommel's greatest mistake came when he was called to the European theatre and tasked with defending France from the imminent Allied invasion in 1944. Rommel, once a hero of the Axis forces, knew that the Allies would soon land in Normandy. Despite his experience in strategy and his knowledge of Allied tactics, Rommel made a critical miscalculation. He believed the Allies would land at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route to Paris, and thus concentrated his forces there. Meanwhile, the Allies, in a masterstroke of deception, staged a fake invasion at Pas-de-Calais and landed in Normandy. Rommel's failure to properly anticipate the location of the invasion and his belief that the Allies would follow conventional logic led to the rapid collapse of the German defences in France. Rommel's mistake meant that the German forces were caught off guard. The Allies quickly established a beachhead in Normandy, and the subsequent retreat of German forces left France vulnerable. Rommel's failure to defend against the D-Day landings contributed to the rapid defeat of Nazi Germany in the West. The Desert Fox was outwitted, not by the brilliance of the Allies but by his own overconfidence. In the end, his miscalculations led to the collapse of the German defense and the liberation of France. 10. We head to Spain, where we find Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator who managed to avoid the horrors of World War II by sitting on the sidelines. Franco's decision not to enter the war was, in hindsight, one of the biggest missed opportunities, and one of the most cowardly decisions made by any European leader. After leading Spain through the brutal Spanish Civil War and establishing a fascist regime, Franco had the chance to side with Hitler and Mussolini during World War II, but he hesitated. Despite being ideologically aligned with the Axis powers, Franco was afraid of committing Spain to a war it couldn't win. He promised Hitler to send troops, but never followed through. He even allowed German submarines to refuel in Spanish ports, yet Spain never officially entered the conflict. This cautious inaction cost Spain dearly. While Franco's regime managed to avoid the devastation of war, his refusal to take sides left Spain isolated in post-war Europe, with its economy in ruins and its reputation tarnished. Franco's refusal to join the war meant that Spain remained politically and economically isolated after the conflict. The country missed out on the post-war recovery that much of Europe experienced, and Franco's authoritarian regime continued to stifle Spain's growth for decades. Franco thought he could sit on the fence and avoid the war, but in the end, his hesitation left Spain weakened and politically irrelevant for years to come. If you think these decisions were some of the dumbest in history, give this video a like, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more insane historical moments. Drop a comment below, let me know where you're watching from, and who you think deserves a spot on this list. 11. Heinrich Himmler, one of the darkest figures in Nazi Germany. As the head of the SS, Himmler oversaw some of the most horrific atrocities in history. But perhaps his greatest failure was his inability to understand the scope of the disaster he was creating. Himmler's role in the Holocaust is well known, but what many forget is his blind ambition and misguided belief that his actions were justified. As Himmler became more obsessed with the idea of an Aryan race, he pushed for the systematic extermination of millions of people, particularly Jews, through the creation and expansion of death camps. His involvement in the final solution was not just a case of following orders, it was driven by an ideology that justified mass murder on an industrial scale. But in the end, Himmler's arrogance led to his downfall. He failed to see the international response that would come as the world discovered the true scale of Nazi atrocities. As the Allies advanced, Himmler tried to negotiate peace behind Hitler's back, realizing too late that his empire was crumbling. He even attempted to flee but was captured by British forces. Instead of facing the justice he so richly deserved, Himmler took the cowardly route, committing suicide by cyanide. Himmler's legacy is stained with the blood of millions, and his failure to understand the repercussions of his actions led to the complete destruction of the Nazi regime. While the Holocaust left scars that would never heal, Himmler's attempts at escape only added insult to injury, and his suicide marked the cowardice of a man who had tried to create a master race, only to see his empire collapse into nothing. Himmler believed in the purity of the Aryan race, but it was his own downfall that revealed how empty that belief truly was. A man who helped create history's most horrific genocide, only to disappear into shame and failure. 12. We turn to Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister who, in 1939, signed a pact with Adolf Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On the surface, this was a diplomatic victory for the Soviet Union, a non-aggression pact between two ideologically opposed powers. But the true story is far darker. Molotov, a key figure in Stalin's inner circle, was duped by Hitler. He believed that this agreement would give the Soviet Union a free hand in Eastern Europe, but he failed to grasp the true nature of Nazi intentions. Molotov, whose name would forever be tied to this pact, failed to see the writing on the wall. In signing the agreement, he allowed Germany to focus on its Western Front while Hitler prepared to invade the Soviet Union. The pact gave the Germans the time they needed to secure their position in Europe, but Molotov wasn't just tricked once. He failed to recognize that the Nazis would eventually turn on the Soviets. When Operation Barbarossa began in 1941, Molotov was left scrambling to prepare for an invasion that he had foolishly helped to enable. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact allowed Nazi Germany to split Poland with the Soviet Union and made Stalin's forces more vulnerable when the inevitable betrayal came. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Molotov had to watch as his country bled and suffered under the brutal advance of German troops. Molotov signed a pact with a man he believed he could trust, but that decision would seal the fate of millions. A diplomat who thought he had played the game of chess, but was outmaneuvered by the very man he tried to partner with. 13. Let's turn to Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister most famous for his policy of appeasement towards Nazi Germany. In 1938, Chamberlain made what would become one of the most controversial decisions in British history. He signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler, allowing Germany to annex parts of Czechoslovakia in exchange for promises of peace. The agreement was hailed as a diplomatic triumph at the time, but in reality it was nothing short of a catastrophic failure. Chamberlain believed that by conceding to Hitler's demands he could avoid war. In his famous speech he returned to Britain claiming he had secured peace for our time. But history would prove him tragically wrong. Hitler's ambitions were far greater than Chamberlain had anticipated, and just a year later the world was plunged into the Second World War. Chamberlain's belief that appeasement could work made him blind to the true nature of Nazi expansion. He thought he could avoid war by giving Hitler a piece of Europe, but in doing so, he handed the Nazis the means to continue their conquests. The Munich Agreement failed to stop Hitler, and by the time the war began in 1939, Britain was unprepared and ill-equipped for the conflict. Chamberlain's miscalculation was a costly one, and the shame of his appeasement followed him until the end of his political career. Chamberlain thought he could secure peace, but instead he gave away the future of Europe. A man who wanted to avoid war but ended up leading his nation into it, far too late to prevent the devastation that followed. Next is 14. Let's talk about Hiroshi Oshima. Japan's ambassador to Nazi Germany during World War II. Oshima's role was pivotal in the alliance between Japan and Germany, but his greatest mistake came when he failed to understand the nature of the Nazi regime. Despite being one of the key diplomats to help forge the Axis powers, Oshima's blindness to Hitler's true intentions led to disastrous consequences for Japan. In 1941, Oshima was one of the key figures who helped facilitate Japan's entry into the war alongside Germany. But he failed to see that Hitler had no interest in a partnership with Japan. Hitler was simply using Japan as a pawn in his grand plan for world domination. While Japan was distracted by its conquest of China and the Pacific, Hitler was focused on Europe. And when Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor, Oshima had no idea how it would change the course of the war. Instead of aligning with a powerful ally, Japan found itself isolated in a world war that it could never win. Oshima's failure to understand the dynamics of the Axis alliance led to Japan's isolation. As the US entered the war, Japan found itself under attack from all sides, and the outcome was inevitable: defeat. Oshima's failure to grasp the bigger picture ensured Japan's participation in a conflict it couldn't survive. Hiroshi Oshima thought he was securing Japan's future by aligning with Nazi Germany. But in reality, he led his country into a trap from which there would be no escape. 15. Is Reinhard Heydrich one of the most feared men in the Nazi regime? As the head of the SS Security Service and the mastermind behind the infamous 1Z conference, Heydrich was responsible for planning the systematic extermination of Jews in Europe. His actions made him a key figure in the Holocaust, but it was his overconfidence that led to his downfall. Heydrich, known as the Butcher of Prague, believed he was untouchable. His ruthlessness and his role in orchestrating mass murder gave him immense power within the Third Reich. But Heydrich made a fatal mistake in 1942. He was targeted in a daring assassination attempt by Czech resistance fighters who had been trained by the British Special Operations Executive. The assassination of Heydrich in Prague was a stunning blow to the Nazis. Despite his brutality, Heydrich's death sparked one of the most vicious reprisals by the Nazis, leading to the destruction of entire Czech villages and the execution of hundreds of civilians. The consequence of Heydrich's arrogance was his own death, and the brutal punishment that followed left an indelible scar on Czech society. Heydrich's reign of terror may have ended with his assassination, but the damage he caused was immeasurable. His death did not bring justice. It only fueled more hatred and violence, leading to the suffering of countless innocents. Reinhard Heydrich thought he was untouchable, but in the end, his own arrogance sealed his fate. A man who orchestrated genocide, only to be cut down by the very people he thought he could crush. If you make it to this moment, drop a comment below. Let me know what time is it now. Great. Let's continue with the next in the list is 16, Douglas MacArthur, the American general who led forces in the Pacific Theater during World War II. MacArthur was a man of immense ego and pride, but his overconfidence would lead to some monumental blunders. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, MacArthur was tasked with defending the Philippines. Unfortunately, he was unable to anticipate the scale of the Japanese threat. Instead of reinforcing the Philippines and preparing for an imminent attack, MacArthur was obsessed with creating a defensive line that could withstand anything. But he underestimated the speed at which the Japanese would strike. The result? The Philippines fell within months, and MacArthur was forced to flee to Australia. His famous promise to return to the Philippines would become a symbol of his failure, not his triumph. MacArthur's inability to act decisively and his overestimation of his own capabilities cost thousands of lives. While he later returned to liberate the Philippines, the damage had been done. His premature optimism had led to the unnecessary loss of life and resources. His failure to properly defend the Philippines would haunt him for the rest of the war. MacArthur believed that his fame and reputation could shield him from failure. But when the tide turned, he found himself running for safety, a general who had been humbled by his own overconfidence. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date on all the nutty stories from humanity's past.